Okay, please welcome your host for this evening, LAist reporter Caitlin Hernández.
Hello, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed this exclusive screening here tonight for Voces Latino Vote 2024. I'm Caitlin Hernández. As Rebecca said, I'm one of the reporters here that's been working on our elections coverage this season. And tonight we're going to be looking at how some of the issues that were shown in the documentary show up in California and also in LA County as well. So we're going to bring up our guests now. I'm going to go ahead and introduce, first up, we have Andrés Cediel, who's an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker. He is a producer on Voces Latino Vote 2024 and also an associate professor in residence at UC Berkeley. Please welcome Andrés Cediel. Got some fans in here. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Mindy Romero. She's the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy at the USC Sol Price School of Public Policy and a faculty member there. Her research focuses on political behavior and race and ethnicity, and she seeks to explain patterns of voting and political underrepresentation, especially among youth and communities of color in California. Please welcome Dr. Romero. And rounding out our discussion tonight is Dr. Fernando Guerra. He's a professor of political science and Chicano Latino studies and is director of the Thomas and Dorothy Leavey Center for the Study of Los Angeles at Loyola, Marymount University. He's also a lifetime trustee here at Southern California Public Radio. Please welcome Dr. Fernando Guerra. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I'm excited for our discussion. I really want to start out with some level setting here. Obviously, as the documentary points out very clearly, Latinos are not a monolith. So tell me, I want to hear from each of you, tell me, why do we look at voting needs information through a lens of race and ethnicity? What do we learn there? And we can start with Fernando or Dr. Guerra.
Yes, race is an identifier. It structured our politics from the very beginning. The white identity that ruled this country prevented other ethnic groups from participating. It enslaved them, it conquered them. And so from day one, we had identity politics. And so it's continued to this day. The founders and all those who continued to focus on this identity as a way of oppression and now a way of vote dilution. And so when we talk about identity politics, the number one practitioners were white males, and it's always been a response to that. By the way, I'm the most conservative member of the Chicano Studies Department at LMU. So identity plays an incredible part in the history of American politics, and it continues to this day. If I know your ethnicity, I have a good chance of determining how you think and how you vote, where you live, etc. It's not foolproof, but I'll tell you one thing for sure. More Latinos will vote in 2024 than ever before. Probably 1 million more Latinos, right? For sure, without a doubt, in absolute numbers. I will also tell you for sure that the majority will vote Democratic from the national to the local level. And that will also impact races that are absolutely close, right? And then our system determines whether Latinos make a difference or not. So I think in one of your very first graphs, you had all the competitive states, and it showed how many Latino registered voters, I think, were like in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in Nevada, and Wisconsin. You take all 4 of those states, there are more Latino registered voters in Los Angeles County alone than all 4 of those states combined. So why is that more important to focus on those 4 states with less Latino voters than we have here in LA County? Because of the electoral college system, and that they're going to make a difference there. And so my point there is that our electoral system, our electoral rules, oftentimes determines what we focus on. And I'm a professor. I could talk for another 3 hours, but I'll stop right now.
Thank you very much. Dr. Romero, I'm curious. I know that you had some thoughts we were talking about backstage. Why do you think it's important to look at voting trends through in the city?
Sure. Well, Fernando said so much that I agree with. All of it I agree with. So maybe what I'll add is just, usually often when we get that, or at least when I get that question, it's from people who don't want us to disaggregate or do the research by race ethnicity, right? Like, why does it matter? You shouldn't be differentiating. We're all Americans. But when you dig a little deeper, there often is a pretty significant set of reasons why they don't want to see that disaggregation. They find it threatening. They feel their politics are different than the folks that we're talking about in our research, things like that. But as Fernando said, it matters, right? Not just historically, but today. Sometimes I'll even hear from individuals, right, that'll say to me, folks of color, Latinos, will tell me, well, I don't see myself in those numbers, right? And maybe even sometimes we'll kind of balk at it or be concerned about what we're saying about the group, right? And they feel they have their own agency and they don't want to kind of be simplified, right? Or in that way. And I'll say though, again, the data tell us that not only are we treated right a certain way, right, by our race or ethnicity, the system, right, can take us into patterns. But also the reality is that when we talk about campaign outreach and mobilization efforts, people are engaged with or not engaged with by the system because of the different numbers, right? Modeling out who are the likely voters. So you may feel like you're going to be different, but the system itself is engaging with you, even currently in the election, in this round. And it impacts the type of information you get, whether you get asked to vote, a whole host of kind of different actions, right, based on your race or ethnicity, based on how you've been modeled out in terms of the likelihood of voting. So, and that affects people's ability to be able to act individually. Yeah.
All right.
When the director and producer, Bernardo Ruiz, called me up and asked me if I wanted to work on this piece, he had produced a similar piece in 2020. So let's do something on the Latino vote. I said, yeah, let's do it. Okay, I'm in. What is the Latino? What Latinos, like, is that even the right word? Should we be saying Latino? Should we say Hispanic? Should we say Latinx? Should we say Latine? So we don't even have a term that is agreed upon by everybody to describe this group.
Hey, you forgot Chicano, by the way.
Oh yeah, Chicano. I mean, let's not forget Chicanos. And we can go on. And the point being that once you start to look deeper into the community and the demographics, it becomes even more diverse in a beautiful way. And so then understanding now that and I'll use the term Latino for the sake of discussion, that are now the second largest voting bloc in the country. Now let's get some more attention on that, and what does that mean? What does it actually look at when you go down into the ground levels to see what's happening in Georgia and Pennsylvania? And of course, the electoral college system was created in a racialized space as well, right? So that's why that's happening. Mexican and Mexican Americans in California are going to be a very different community than what we're going to see in the rest of the country in different areas. And so understanding, what motivates Dominicans and Venezuelans and Colombian immigrants might be very different. So I got really excited about it. There was a little joke very early on in the process. It's like, could we make this film and never use the word Latino? Just like, we're getting to the point where Latinos are just, especially when you look at the youngest Latinos, who are where the majority of the growth is coming from. Second, third generation Latinos less and less think of themselves as Latinos and think of themselves as I'm an American, and they start acting more like the bigger population. So even though I thought about we might be able to do that, we must have said Latino about 550 times in this film.
I need to know if you actually used a counter for that. Andrés, I want to go to you. I think what you're hitting at is exactly one of the things that I loved about the documentary, is how it shows like the diversity and range in Latino communities. It's not even just one community. It's a lot of subgroups and ethnicities in between that and nationalities. And so one of the things that I really appreciated about the documentary is how, you have this healthy overview of kind of like the political structures at play, but you also zero in on people's personal lives in a way that, in my opinion, felt very much like nonpartisan. Like, we're all affected by high housing costs. We're all affected by economic issues. And so I'm curious, when it came to producing the movie, was that an intentional decision to highlight the kind of more personal perspectives?
Yes, I think what happened was we filmed most of this in April, May, June, knowing that we're going to have a late October release and everything is going to change. What are we going to do? How do we structure a film that's not going to be about the horse race or whatever October surprise? It turned out to be, July that Biden dropped out? I mean, it was like we had to redo the film to a significant portion at that time. But we were thinking about how are we going to make something that it doesn't feel like, this is for a PBS audience, which is an overwhelmingly white audience and older. How are we going to make a film that is not like, oh, look at the Latinos? Like, this is what the Latinos care about. And so how can we show who we are? So our team that we put together was also a diverse team of Latinos. I have Colombian descent. Marcia Robio, who was one of the producers, is of Dominican descent. Bernardo's of Mexican descent. So we had a range within our producing team as well, and just really thought the first thing we also do, hopefully, is we do some reporting as we go out and talk to people and say, what do you care about? And what do Latinos care about? Victor Martinez says it very well. Mike Madrid says it very well. We care about everything everybody else cares about. Okay, so then let's go and see what that's happening. What are their lives like, so that then the audience can connect on that human level and show who we are.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Mero, I'd love to go to you to kind of talk about more of those needs. As we've seen in stats, I'm sure 1 in 5 Latinos will be voting for the first time this election for president. And since we're here in California, I think last I checked, about 40% or more of the population is Latino. Talk to me about what are some of the priorities here in California for Latinos, and how could that maybe differ from a state that's known as more conservative, like say Florida, for example?
And just to give you a couple more numbers, we're a little over 40% of the population, certainly, but when you talk about the eligible voter population, since we're talking about voting, so adult citizens, it's a smaller share. So it's about 33% or so, and that's always important when we're talking about representation, right, to understand that. And it's about 7 million or so, right, that are registered. So in terms of priorities, I guess whenever I get that question, the first thing I think about is actually really to emphasize that Latinos have more in common, and we have poll after poll to show us this, or surveys after surveys to show us this, more in common with the overall electorate than not in common. And why do I emphasize that? Because so often, right, people want to marginalize the needs and issues, concerns, right, of the Latino community. So it's over here, it's different. Oh, how can we meet it? We wish we could, right? Or they're so different, right? Or to, whatever it might be, right? To this, to that. And really, when you look at the top 5 concerns, right, top issues in any given period, they're generally the same, right? And the difference maybe can be emphasis. Particularly for young Latinos, there's what's most salient or most actionable, or like climate justice, social justice. Currently, right now, across the board, it's economics, it's jobs, the economy, it's inflation, right? Regardless of race, ethnicity, right? So I just want to, in California, our politics, we are blue. I like to say we're shades of blue in many communities of red. I've been saying that for years. Nobody wants to pick that up. It's a little too long-winded, but it's true. And so, of course, just our politics, we tend to, Georgia is a purple state, really in many ways still a red state. But, I can answer your question in terms of certainly there's more conversation and picked up in polling, more concerns about environmental issues, for instance, right, or social justice issues. But really there's more in common. And I think it's so important to emphasize that when we're talking about trying to get the attention of the political landscape, when we're fighting for recognition and demanding attention to issues, right, that the community cares about. there's power in differentiation, but sometimes there's also power in, hey, we're all in this together, right? So that's my thought.
Thank you.
If I answered your question, I'm not sure if I did.
No, you did. Thank you. And I think that's too something that came out in the documentary where you know these issues were being brought up with maybe a community. I think that some of the churches you spotlighted, for example, you know, the concerns they're raising about immigration, for example, and how that's kind of like this nuance. So it's not necessarily like, oh, we're a Republican, we only vote this way. There's a lot of overlap too. So I thought that was really compelling. Thank you. Dr. Guerra, I want to go to you. I thought it was interesting on when Mike was up on the screen briefly and in the interview, and he was saying something about how, you know, Democrats are more animated by social issues and how Republicans are usually more animated by economics, for example. I'm curious, in a place like LA County, how does that play out here? I'm curious, like, if you see any more nuance to that happening.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I completely agree. I think we're more, it may be degrees, but, and maybe Republicans are willing to speak about that more and first. But in terms of economics, I think it ends up trumping most of these issues. I thought you know, when we're looking at Mike Madrid and that one scene where he's at his house on the porch and they're talking and they start talking about the economy, I want you, no two elections are alike. When we try to create trends about presidential elections, I'm a quantitative guy, and oftentimes I'm looking at observations. I was just talking to Mindy about a survey or research that we're doing right now where we're looking at 3,000 different people, et cetera. Well, you know, there's only been, you know, like less than 100 national elections. And modern elections, we're talking about only 10 or 12. So when we try to create trends from that, it's just impossible to do that. Every single national election is unique, but the economy plays an important role. If you were to close your eyes, which is really difficult to do, not close your eyes, but to not think about Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, and you were to say, here's an election, and these are the economic facts, without talking about there's a generic Republican and a generic Democrat, the Republican should win that election and should win it easily. The last time you had the closest situation was 1980, you know, with Jimmy Carter running for re-election with very high inflation, very difficult economic situation. I would say that's the closest in terms of just generic. And Ronald Reagan won easily. And I would have said that just generically, this is a Republican year vis-a-vis the economy. What makes it more competitive is the issue of reproductive rights. And so now you're bringing those progressive issues, but also the changing demographics and Donald Trump's candidacy, et cetera. And so, yes, economics are incredibly important to both Democrats and Republicans and to Latinos and non-Latinos. But there are sometimes issues that will trump that, meaning a candidacy like Trump, or reproductive rights, or other things. I'll also say one thing, that Arizona and Nevada are only competitive because of Latinos. If you take a look at Arizona, they haven't voted for a Democrat for like 50 years until 2020, you know, and that thing is really shifting. And it really wasn't the economy per se; it was about, I think, ethnicity, identity, and the changing issues that are happening in Arizona.
Right.
Can I add something?
Sure. Go for it.
So there are two things here. If we just separate out, there is what the potential electorate, right, and the electorate, right, feels, and then and believes, right, in the issues that they care about and the issues they may potentially vote on, and then there are the groups that organize them, right, and I think that might have been not it's dangerous to try to get into the mind of Mike Madrid, but I think he might have been kind of touching
That's
on.
the next documentary,
Yes.
the mind of Michael
But I think
Madrid.
he might have been touching on that a little bit as well, right? So the groups that are out doing the work, right, to organize the Latino community, I think many more of them are talking about more social issues, right? And you know, you can definitely make a case that, you know, in 2016 and 2020, that a lot of the mobilization that was happening was focused on immigration, right? Or focused in anti-Trump, you know, beating that drum, right? And wasn't talking about bread and butter issues, and that it was a lost opportunity, right? Period, to mobilize Latinos, and then potentially in terms of the Republican, right, Democratic divide and perspective. So I just want to say that in terms of what individuals, right? Because when we're talking about the Latino community, still in any given election, the majority, sometimes the overwhelming majority of eligible Latinos are not participating, right? In presidential years, that changes, but still huge proportions are not participating. There's very real reasons for that. Significant barriers in our electoral system. I want to make that clear. It's not apathy. It's not the sleeping giant. But one factor is that the outreach that's happening, first of all, there's a lot less. So even if you're a registered Latino, you're much more less likely to get outreach to and mobilized and asked to vote, as was talked about in the documentary. But also, what you are hearing when you are, you know, when people are connecting with you, sometimes it's really it's focused on a single issue that may not resonate for you, right? Because it's driven by groups who are doing good work, who care, but that are single issue driven, right? And there's very little funding and money out there to support more general kind of outreach efforts about representation and about voice, and less on a specific issue. Does that make sense? And it just can be a detriment, right? I'm not saying that the mobilization that occurs on particular issues shouldn't happen, but it does impact. There's a lack of broader mobilization, lack of mobilization period, and lack of broader mobilization in terms of issues that I think we have seen, right, negative impacts from that. And we just don't talk about it as much.
Right.
Yeah, but
Please.
so I agree, but I would interpret it this way. What I interpret you saying is there's nothing wrong with immigrant rights groups going out there and only mobilizing on immigration. That's what they care about, et cetera. What is wrong is that there aren't other groups being funded either by candidates or the Democrats to also go out there and mobilize on the economics or other issues.
Yeah, or a
right?
broad set of issues,
Or
right?
broad set of
that
issues,
that is
yeah.
it's that maybe bends to the specifics of the community, right, and their interests as well. Talking to the community, what do you care about? What's relevant here, right? What could mobilize you? Let's talk about, you know, what the issues that you want to maybe see action on, and we'll make voting an actionable step on the issues you care about. So yeah.
I can listen to you both go back and forth. You don't even need me here on the stage. Thank you for that. I want to pose a question to the group as well, but we'll start with you, Dr. Merrill. One of the parts that I really enjoyed about the documentary was this kind of explanation of like, there's this narrative that, Latinos are going to the right. But when you look at data, it's a different story than that when you know the context. I'm really curious. When I watched that, I was like, I wonder what the context is for California. What have our voting trends been like? So I'm curious, like, what do you know about what the trends have been like here?
So, I said about shades of blue, right? Of course, we haven't always been a blue state, right? Ronald Reagan was governor of California. We used to be red for a very long time. And then we were purple for a blip, and then blue, and now solidly blue, right? And for the Latino vote, it really was, Latinos were kind of like more evenly split when we were a red state. Not completely, but higher Republican registration. And then Proposition 187, at least as we commonly think about it, the big shift was around Proposition 187. The rhetoric that we saw during the Pete Wilson administration, specifically Proposition 187 and the ads, and does anybody remember that here in the audience? Felt very, very anti-Latino and felt really a threat to the Latino community. Here again, though, can be very important distinction. There was how individual Latinos reacted to it, and then there also was the mobilizing effort, right? A whole generation of young California Latinos entered into politics, entered into mobilizing, and all of that effort, right, as they reached out to the Latino community, resulted in more Democratic registration, right? And Latinos became solidly Democratic, and it's part of why California became blue. But at the same time, and we do have to recognize there are demographic shifts. So, the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of Latino immigration, right, happening in the state. And now there is less immigration, has slowed down substantially. And we know that we have generational differences. We have many more, right, proportionally U.S. born, right, Latinos. So I say that there's always been an opportunity for Republicans to gain background in California. There's an opportunity for Democrats to gain more ground in California. And what's happening is that both parties do a horrible job in mobilizing the Latino vote in the state. And it usually only happens when it's a competitive district, and we don't have that many. Out of our, all of our congressional districts, only 6 of them, all right, are competitive in this cycle. And so, historically, people often will ask me, like, they look at the patterns and they say, well, why don't we see more effort with the California Democratic Party to reach out to the Latinos? Because if you register a whole bunch of Latinos, right, because Latinos still are overwhelmingly registering Democrat, you're going to get a lot of Democrats. But parties don't always want new voters, and they don't always want new Latinos because they can't predict, right? Maybe the incumbent won't be popular amongst those new Latino Democrats. Maybe there may be a push for somebody from the community, right? Or the endorsed, candidate won't win. And so new brings uncertainty. And so both parties have done a really bad job. That's a long answer to your question. But there are opportunities going forward, and we have seen some shifts, recent shifts. It really depends on where you want to start the clock, as the documentary noted. And I think we're going to have to see how things kind of play out. But there's opportunities for both and all parties in this state if there was better, more sincere, more well-funded outreach to the Latino community, but voters of color, period.
Right. On that note, Andres, I want to go to you real quick. We're going to go to Q&A for a second, or soon, so please feel free to keep your questions in mind. But on that note, on what Dr. Romero brought up about the new voter being kind of a risk, you and I talked before about this kind of generational shift that happens. Talk to me a little bit about what you learned.
Well, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about when you were bringing up 187 is a similar thing happened in Arizona. So then as Arizona became more hardline against immigration, we started to see these groups like Lucha really get mobilized and then make Arizona blue, and we'll see what happens now. And a lot of that going to be motivated by issues around reproductive rights, as was noted in the film. If you think about across the country, most of the growth in Latinos is happening in young folks. So what do they care about? So then it's a lot of the, and this is where the Mike Madrid, we talked about that in the Mike Madrid's point about the cultural issues versus the economic issues, because on one level that's just wrong. Everybody cares about the economy. But I think what he was trying to get at, and we were talking a little bit about in the evangelical section, is there are some issues that then become a bright line between different communities in terms of reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, those marriage equality. Those things start to break off into different splits in different communities that you start to see where the young people are going to be. So across the country, and the other thing that we found, and also the point that you had made about the top 5 issues generally are the same but in different emphasis. Yeah, immigration is up there, but also gun violence keeps on coming up. And that's not an issue that gets talked about a lot on a national level. So that was a big reason why we had that in the film, is to say, wait a second, this is happening disproportionately high in the community, and it's linked to hate crimes. And that is also something that's coming from the rhetoric in the news. So these are things that young people do think about, and they do feel because it's happening in their communities, and that's what's a lot of times motivating them.
And if I can make one, immigration is still, of course, I want to make sure I'm making that point, an important issue to the Latino community, to many communities, right? But sometimes it's not the most important issue. Sometimes it's instructive, right, in terms of getting a sense of whether a candidate is pro or for, right? But it's not necessarily the issue that somebody's going to vote on, right? And what happened, I think, as I was referencing like 2016 and 2020, that some of the messages, very important messages, right, to talk about immigration, of course, but some of those fell flat to some Latinos who said, okay, yeah, I agree with you, right? But I'm not going to vote based on that. And then didn't hear other issues too. And some, I don't agree with you, right? And didn't hear other messages to maybe counter that and still bring them out for one party or another. So I just want to, it's an important issue, but again, not a monolith. And you always have to be thinking about what is the issue or issues. And sometimes, let's be honest also, voters don't always vote on issues, right? Voters take shortcuts as well, and there can be other things that are salient to people that often we need to be really in the Latino community. What we really need to see is the long game in terms of outreach and mobilization, right? Not coming in 2 weeks or even 2 months before an election, using trusted messengers, dating for a long time instead of knocking on the door and saying, please marry me, and seriously, right? And building trust, especially in a community that has often been historically, and still today, politically marginalized, and making the case for voting, right? Not just please vote for me, but make the case for voting, period, and do it in a sincere way, right? And over time, and that's also what we don't see. And so you come in sometimes on issues, and people don't even know where to trust on the issue, even if you are talking about specifically the issue they care about, because there's neglect until it's 2 weeks before the election.
There's one more point I want to make about the young voters. So as part of this hour, we also are doing a bunch of digital shorts, which are focusing on first-time voters, and a lot of them in California. And there was one that was already published. You can see it online. But a first-time voter in Fresno. And so this is a young man. He's of Mexican descent. His parents, his family were undocumented. They worked as farm workers. And he is voting for Trump. And he thinks, this is the way forward. We're in America now. You got to take care of America first. And so that demographic, you're thinking, oh, that's a little dissonance in terms of the way I'm thinking this as an child of undocumented immigrants. But it's also a growing sentiment among second and third generation Latino men. And I wanted to make that distinction because
very important.
There's within our community, there's the biggest gender gap between Latinas and Latinos in terms of education levels, and also who's voting for Kamala and who's voting for Trump. And so there's the largest gender gap among Latinos and Latinas also in civic participation as well. So these are all issues that need to be talked about in our community. So it's not just that we're not a monolith in terms of ethnicity. Also, we have to look at gender when we're looking at this community.
Right. Well, Andres, I know as we've seen, the documentary covers a lot of different issues, and I think very well, by the way. I've never taken in so many different topics and be like, wow, I get it. I'm exposing a little of myself there. But yeah, and I just think it does so well. And so there's a lot that people are going to be going home with tonight. So I'm curious for you, as a producer, what do you want people to think about when they go home?
Oh my God, which you just, that you learned something. I think, to be honest, when we set out to do this, there was I had a lot of doubt of what we were going to be able to do. It's like, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're going to have to talk, we have to do the top 5 issues. No, we don't have time. We can only do 3 issues. Oh, we can only do 3 battleground states. Oh, but if we leave out those, we're going to leave, it's like, oh no, we're going to try to do everything, and we can't do everything. So my concern was that we were going to cover everything too superficially. And so we spent a lot of time really making sure that if you were going to get something about immigration, it was going to be a nuance or advance your knowledge of what you had known before, right? Maybe if you thought you knew something about evangelicals, we're going to tell you a little bit something different. So what I hope people come away with is not just understanding the breadth and diversity of our community, but also learning more about these issues that affect all of us, and really understanding that these are all of our issues and we need to inform ourselves because there's lots of different opinions about these issues and we need to be listening to all of them.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right, we're going to open it up for audience questions. And my one caveat before we start passing the mic around is please make it a question, not a comment, por favor. You can always come up to us after and share everything as well. All right, we can go ahead. And who would like to ask?
I didn't know you were getting audience questions. This is so exciting.
Oh, yes, yes.
Thank you so much for the documentary. It was wonderful. I was really intrigued by Mike Madrid and what he was saying, and I'm just really curious if there were things that came up when he was being interviewed that maybe didn't make it into the film. I think his messaging has been really confusing to me, especially his comments about machismo, and there's like a chapter in his book, and I was just really curious if that came up.
There's a lot of Mike Madrid that didn't get in. And, he's got a podcast, he's got a book, he's on Twitter. You should check that out.
And he's got a newsletter.
Yeah, exactly.
He's everywhere. This sounds like a Mike Madrid plant.
Cool. And did you want to elaborate on anything that didn't make it in by chance?
I'd have to think about that.
That's fair.
There was
Well,
there was a lot that didn't
I
get
don't
in.
think one of the things that didn't capture for Mike Madrid there is how Republican he is, that you kind of get that, but how anti-Trump he is. And yeah, you don't really get it from the film that he's really one of the leading anti-Trump individuals in the country.
Yeah.
Founding member of the Lincoln Project.
Right.
You know.
And you also, you do pick it up visually, but not necessarily in the words or verbally, how Latino he is too, right?
Yeah, so Mike Madrid, he was a Reagan Republican, grew up just, the Reagan library, he could see it from his house, and, but then, at great risk to himself and his political career and at times his safety, became extremely anti-Trump in founding the Lincoln Project. So he has a very strong voice, I think.
Yeah.
And a strong voice on what is needed in terms of mobilizing the Latino community. He has strong opinions and a strong voice around it, and has been pretty outspoken in terms of some of his concerns about polling and the lack of landing of messages that are important and so forth. So yeah, this is a Mike Madrid commercial now.
There you go. All right, go to the back here.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to ask, I guess it's two questions, and that is to get a response from the panelist about the messaging that's happening, because I think what I didn't see in the documentary, which brought out very, very good points that rubbed me really wrongly, but it was good. It was very good points. That there didn't seem to be I think the fundamental question of whether in one case there is a trend away from democracy, and in the other case, in the other party, there is trying to salvage what democracy we have, and with the influx of younger people to expand it, which I think came from Bernie and from Occupy and those things. So that's one message that I didn't see, that there's this diversion. And in this messaging also, there is a narrowing of the message of a woman's right, the same rights that men have. And I don't think in that message, and I'd like to know if you agree or what your points are, your opinions are, that the message around the questions of a woman's right to, democratic right to choose, because it's being reduced to the question of abortion. And abortion is a different question than your right to choose.
Reproductive freedom.
Well, even reproductive freedom is still one step lower, I think, than the right to choose. Yes, to choose your reproductive freedom or to choose, any other thing. And I think they're being pigeonholed. I think our population is being pigeonholed into this question. So I think those two issues, the choice of whether we are going to have more or less democracy or we're moving away from it, I think.
Yeah, but I think the documentary did a good job in terms of avoiding that, and I'll tell you why. Okay, I believe the way you just asked the question, I totally agree with you, that the question should be asked, and that should be a major issue. But if you're going to do a political film or a film that talks to Republicans and you ask that question, they don't see it that way. And now you can say that they're delusional and they don't get it, but they really don't believe it's the end of democracy. And so it's almost like a non-starter. And you're not going to create a dialogue with them when you start out by that, And so that I don't think the film would have, or the documentary, I think it would have taken away from even bringing that up, because it wouldn't have caught what the film was about in my sense. So, and then the reproductive rights were brought up. You had the whole segment in Arizona and how that is mobilizing different individuals, and it was important to bring it up in Arizona because it's going to be on the ballot. And I, as a, you could tell, but I'm a partisan, right? That I think Harris is more likely to win Arizona than some of those other states. Even though people say it's closer, on the ground and what's been happening, I feel more comfortable predicting that she will win Arizona than even some of the other competitive states. And a lot of it is because of that reproductive rights.
I'm going to add just one thing about democracy, the lens, right, and the difference between Republicans and Democrats. There's actually some survey work that's been shown that is showing us actually how the word democracy is really becoming stigmatized for a lot of Republicans. It's a word that they want to avoid. It can signal, the use of the word signals things that it doesn't signal for Democrats. And that is just, going down that path is just, for me, right, I feel, incredibly dangerous, right? That you can't even use the word. You can disagree about whether our democracy is in peril, but democracy is becoming almost a bad word, right? Particularly for Republican leadership, I should be fair, So if you look at how there's different kinds of language that we use, that we see right across parties when it comes to talking about what we normally would use would be democracy. So I just want to, when you can't even agree on the word, right, that just takes it to a whole nother level. It's really my point. Yeah, and please.
When something else that wasn't in the film, maybe in this country it's like, oh, Latinos are Democrats, they're liberals, right? Well, maybe here in this country, in some places, at some times, but not in Latin America. If you're from Latin America, you've been to Latin America, there are right-wing Latin Americans, right? And so then as this country becomes more like Latin America, we're going to have Latin Americans of all different kinds and all different kinds of political stripes. So part that was fascinating to me, and there was only a small part of the film, was the journalist from Venezuela coming and talking about how they had lost democracy. Now, of course, that's being spun many different ways because that's under a socialist government. So then, you scare Venezuelans and you scare Cubans because it's going to be the fall of the country. But for me, the part, and for whether I hadn't heard this thing about democracy, which I find really fascinating, because for me, I don't think of democracy, I think of freedom of speech. I think of the freedom of the press. And of course, those go hand in hand. So that's what gets me scared as a journalist, is thinking, okay, wait a second. I don't care if you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. If we can't say what we need to say, now we're in trouble, right? And so I think that those are the issues that those issues are still underlying it, because we don't necessarily have the lack of freedom of expression in this country. What we have is, I'm just going to coin this term right now, misexpression. We have the misinformation, we have the disinformation, and that is almost more dangerous than the lack of being able to express ourselves.
Thank you for that. Anyone else have any questions I'd like to ask? Oh, we're going to have the mic brought up just so everyone can hear you.
Test, cool. Can you elaborate a little more for the three of you on the economy? So in the film, you showed how Republicans care about the economy, but then also Democrats. So then how does that come together in the Latino community? Of course, there will always be a division between, red, middle, and then blue. But then how can there be some sort of understanding, if that makes any sense?
I'll go quickly and then I'll hand it off because I know you guys will have a lot to say. The short answer from what I've picked up is a lot of the Latinos who will look towards Republicans is because they don't want to have to pay taxes on their small businesses, right? That's a very Republican idea, but it's also a very pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that a lot of immigrants have. They come, they want to make money, they want to start a business, they don't want the government to take their money. That's a kind of a Republican idea, which runs contrary to the way Democrats have been organizing labor for a long time in this country, which becomes a very Democrat. So it's kind of a labor versus taxes issue, to make it simplistic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And you saw it in the film on both of them because the young lady in Allentown and that whole discussion, they were talking, we can't afford that, et cetera. The economy is very important to them. And that's why I was saying if this election, the economy is bad, and that's the major driver. And the Republicans and Donald Trump have made it a cornerstone of their campaign, and I think they've been very effective. That's why it's like, to me, it's actually very impressive that Harris is competitive. And I'll predict one thing right now. Kamala Harris.
Get out your phones, everybody.
Kamala Harris is going to get 5 million more votes, and maybe even as many as 10 million more votes than Donald Trump. Okay, that doesn't mean she's going to win. That's the crazy part. It doesn't mean she's going to win, but to me, but that's pretty crazy. But the economy, it really drives a lot of how we talk about it, and then you have to then have a very specific reason to vote against your economic interest or where you think the economy is going. And that could be based on ideology or hope or another particular issue or even ethnic identity. And that will trump that instinct to say, the economy's not going well, I need to, do something else.
So I, of course, agree with both these gentlemen here.
I thought you were going to say both of my personalities or something. The way you
Both sets of comments. I guess the only thing I'd add is just, economy is number one, right? Certainly right now, but and there's a long history in political science, right, identifying that people will blame the party in power, right, particularly the presidency, but you still have to think to some degree, right? At least where the uncertainty is will the other party, is there something that's countering my blame of the current party? Will the other party be better than the current party, right? Will the challenging party be better than the current party, right? And what you believe is the problem, right? If you really think inflation is something that you should be blaming the presidency of the current party for it. So that's just something. But I wanted to say, in terms of if Kamala Harris does, and I do not predict anything, I think it's going to be just too close to call, period. But if she does win the popular vote and she doesn't win the Electoral College, if, in other words, it is indeed incredibly close, we're just in for trouble, period. In terms of the immediate post-election day period. all the way up until Inauguration Day and who knows beyond that. I mean, there's, the multiple scenarios in terms of the challenges, the fights, the rhetoric, the lies, everything that's going to potentially happen coming out of that. That's going to be the challenge for our democracy, how we get through post-election if it is indeed very close. So, not to leave you on a negative note.
Yeah, no.
Get out and vote.
Yeah.
Please, if you have something.
Number
More
one,
positive.
I predict Kamala Harris is going to win.
Ah!
Okay, and I base it on the trend of the polls. Although you shouldn't. I'm a pollster, but there's a lot of problems with polls in terms of they're not predictive. They're telling you what's happening at the particular moment. But more than that, it's actual voting behavior. If you take a look at what happened in 20, and more importantly in 22, and even in the primaries, there's Democrats have won most of the elections in Arizona in the last 3 years, and they're going to continue. They've voted for a female governor and a female U.S. senator. In Wisconsin, the same thing at large. They voted for the Democratic Supreme Court justices, and they have 2 female U.S. senators. Michigan has a female governor and a female U.S. senators, and they've won the elections in 22 in a lower turnout. And you can go on. And so it's about the trends that we see in the type of candidates that are winning, meaning both Democrats and females. And if you just take a look at those facts, and also the fact that this time you see the ground effort happening in these states and the funding of these is that the Democrats have outspent Republicans on the ground getting actual votes out. And so all the indicators that I would look at tell me that she's going to win. It's going to be close, right? And then if she wins, it's very different than 2020 because
Trump was in power.
correct.
In the
Biden is
office.
president, not Trump. And Biden will come out, I believe, and strongly said, she has won, and say it almost immediately. She's won, it's done. And if you think you're going to do something, I'm going to bring everything down. And look at everybody who got in trouble and got convicted. We're going to do that. And so if you're going to take on the state's going to be there. You can call it the deep state, you can call it whatever, but we're going to protect democracy. Those are my 2 predictions.
And I'm not a partisan, but I'll just.
I didn't say that wasn't partisan. I was just like, those were facts and trends.
Well, the only thing I'll throw in there, not to be a negative, but there are in numerous
Okay, that
states.
was my closing statement because you said you were negative, and I was trying. Now you're coming back.
In numerous states, there are efforts underway to still, even if she wins with Biden being in power, right, to still counter that, to take a damn good shot at changing that. And then, of course, what we haven't really talked about today is maybe just touched on a tiny bit. It's just AI and AI-generated misinformation and disinformation, which I still fear that could be the story of this election, other than who wins, particularly in the post-election period during the vote counting. It's just the unknown. It's the wild card. We don't know how it's going to be used exactly. We know it's going to be used, and we don't know what the impact is going to be. I think it depends on the scenarios.
But you can trust PBS.
And
Yes,
LAist.
and you can
And
fact
LAist.
check.
Hello. We are both public media companies, so there you go. All right, we're coming up on time, so it's time for one more question. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you for all the information you have shared tonight. I'm wondering about the youth of the Latino vote and their stands on Gaza, which this really didn't address in deep detail, but we're over a year with this now, and it's spreading across the Middle East. And with on the college campuses being shut down from having a lot of the activities that they had over the last year, how will that affect the election and the Latino vote, with several young people saying they're not going to vote?
I think very little, both in terms of absolute numbers. I'm actually shocked that this is the week of a year ago, right? And I thought, it wasn't a prediction, but I thought we were going to see a lot more activity on college campuses, and I was really surprised how little activity there was on college campuses when they opened up. And then we certainly expected it a lot more. And by the way, the campuses completely overreacted in terms of this past week. I mean, it was like a fortress on many of the campuses, and it muted that. And also there's a sense by some, including some of the leadership of those movements, is that's not, it may not help our cause, because doing this is going to play into Donald Trump and the Republicans on that. The one exception, I think, is in Michigan, where that movement was so strong during that primary, and rightly so. And so number one, the movement did not sustain itself from last spring to the fall. And that always happens in college campuses. All we have, anytime the students get out of control, we just kind of hold them off until May, and then they go away, and then they come back, and it's like, hey, what happened? You know, that's so typical, right? And it happened again. I'm not saying it's not an important issue, et cetera. But even at the height of it, it's not a majority of the students who are going to use that issue as the defining reason why they're going to vote one way or the other, or not vote, or et cetera. So in absolute numbers, I think it's going to play a very small role.
And I'll just add, I agree with all of that. Just looking at it from a numbers perspective too, another way to look at it is the youth vote, while very important, right? Those that are 18 to 24 vote in much lower rates than older voters, 20, 30, 40 percentage points lower depending on the election. We know that, right? Again, lots of barriers for why we see those disparities. So when you see surveys out there, and I do want to respect definitely, right, how many young people are feeling, but when you see surveys out there, or you see interviews of young people that are saying that they're going to withhold their vote, or they may vote in a different way than they thought they were going to, maybe for instance towards Trump or a third party, the first question, and this is what the political campaigns are doing, right, is they're calculating, how many of those young people were going to vote anyway, right? And the question is how many might be motivated to vote based on that when they wouldn't vote. We just don't know. And then the reality is often what you say you're going to do in terms of voting, just even your desire to vote for a third-party candidate, period, maybe because you're sick of the two top candidates, often can be very different on election day, right? Especially the general election, primary versus a general election when, everything's kind of on the line if you're actually there at the ballot box. So absolutely respect, those young people that are struggling with an incredibly important issue. The Biden administration, Kamala Harris, his campaign now, has gotten much of the negative from that because they're obviously the ones who are creating the U.S. policy. Trump has kind of gotten a free ride on it, largely, not fully. But that's the calculation really at the end of the line. And if you're trying to figure out why the campaigns aren't saying more, the campaigns are making those calculations.
Right. Well, thank you all for your questions. They were amazing. And thank you also to our panelists for being here. Andres, I think you mentioned earlier that this documentary is already up online that people can access?
It went up online last night, so you can find it on YouTube. It's also on the PBS site and app. And then there's going to be a national broadcast on October 22nd.
Amazing. So you all can watch it there. So yes, once again, thank you all for coming. I want to say a shout out and thank you to our event staff for helping put this on tonight. And of course, yes, give them all of the rounds of applause. We cannot sound this good without them. And then obviously a big thank you to our partners at PBS SoCal for collaborating with us on this event tonight too as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Please get home safe. Have a good night.